Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about Chapter 4. There's a lot here. I'm going to go through it quickly, and if you stay tuned till the end, most of the quiz review is near the end. So we're going to talk about that, and let's just jump into it. So this follows the book pretty closely. And let me just kind of move my picture out of the way. All right, so the big subheadings in the book are the coming of war, the world at war, the peace settlement, the Russian Revolution, uncertain peace, and the arts. We're going to get through most of those. The one thing I just want to point out here is this chapter title is a little important because for me, the most important takeaways of this chapter is the aftermath of World War One. Okay, so we don't spend a lot of time on the war or the battles or any of that stuff, but really the aftermath and sort of the lessons learned are what we want to key into today. So the war starts in 1914. It's a European war when it begins. The U.S. doesn't get involved in the war right away. And many people thought it was going to be a very quick war. It was going to be over with quickly, and that wasn't the case. And so the first thing we like to think about is, why did the war start in the first place? And so the big causes of the war were rising tensions in Europe, and a lot of these tensions were left over from the Napoleonic Wars. Basically France hates Germany, Germany hates France, the Brits side with the French and the Russians, and there's this alliance called the Triple Entente. Entente means alliance, actually, in France, informal alliance in French. And then on the other side, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, they're the Triple Alliance. If you're an American or a Brit, Germany and the Triple Alliance, those are the bad guys, okay? And if you're French or U.S. or Russian, Triple Entente, that's our side. Those are the good guys. So those are the two alliances that build up. And these are just political alliances, just agreements. Hey, if you go to war with so-and-so, we're going to back you up. Sort of like NATO alliance, something you're familiar with. So that's going on politically. So those are some political tensions. Here's a picture of Theobald Hollweg. He's the German chancellor at the beginning of World War One. I think he looks like the guys from the Dos Equis ads. But anyway, so what's the start of World War One? So again, it's a European war, so the start of it is obviously a European thing. So there's a crisis in the Balkans is the way your book tackles it. But what happens is Archduke Ferdinand gets shot. And probably from elementary school to junior high to high school, history, you've heard about the shot heard around the world for World War One. Well, this is it. And again, Archduke Ferdinand was probably, somewhat of an insignificant guy on his own. He was heir to the Austrian throne, which was a big deal. But again, he was really on the global scene a somewhat insignificant figure. But because tensions were so high between Germany and Russia, and because the Archduke, all right, was an Austrian, and so Austria and Germany were aligned, so they were together, and Serbia and Russia were aligned, and the kid who shot the Archduke, who I'm going to show you in a minute, was a Serbian. So basically the Russians backed up the Serbs, and the Germans backed up the Austrians, and that's really kind of how the war or the spark, I guess, that starts the war, or the shot heard around the world. So Gavrilo Princip, he is the assassin. He's a college student in Serbia. So again, to kind of put this in context of your own life, I certainly suggest that you don't commit any crimes. But again, to kind of give you a feel, this kid was, part of a radicalized group of college students who basically wanted to change things. And so that's how this starts. Here's a picture. You can go on the web and find all this stuff. So here's a picture of the car that the Archduke and his wife, Sophie, were shot in. I should have a picture of Sophie up here, but I don't. And here is a little newspaper headline from the time and another picture of him, much younger. So here's the Balkan Peninsula. This assassination, happens in this area, Bosnia. And so if you're familiar with this region, here's Greece down here. Maybe you've been, or Italy over here in the lower left. So that's where this starts. Not really close to Germany or Hungary, for that matter. But anyway, so tensions build. Russia mobilizes its army under the Tsar. A Tsar is like a king, right? It's important that you know that because this empire of the Tsars, Russian Empire, is going to go away in this chapter. and Germany declares war on Russia in 1914. So again, Russia mobilizes its army after the assassination of the Archduke, and Germany declares war on Russia in 1914, and the U.S. is not in the war. Okay, everyone predicts a fast war, as I mentioned, and the war lasts 4 years and kills 15 to 20 million civilians and soldiers. And, I said this was an industrial war, so, there's some brutal new machines, poison gas is introduced in this war, automatic weapons we'd already had. The first tanks are fashioned in this war based on the invention of the Caterpillar bulldozer here in the U.S. So the first tanks are used by the Brits. So there's a lot of first as far as brand new technologies for killing people. And it was a brutal war. And it ended. I'm not going to go through all the battles. We don't have time. But some key points about the war, again, everyone thought it would be quick, but it became a stalemate because of this idea of trench warfare. In other words, sort of the technology was brand new, the technology of war, but the tactics on how to advance they didn't exist. I mean, generals, soldiers, they didn't know how to fight a war with these guns. Basically what happened was a Western front formed where the Germans had advanced to, and trenches were dug for 400 miles all throughout France, all the way down here to the lower right. This is the Alsace-Lorraine region, and here is Switzerland. So this is about a 400-mile trench, and trench warfare, I think you're familiar with it. It's not pretty. Here are soldiers in trenches. These are Italian soldiers, bless their heart, and it was hard to advance. And if you can imagine two trenches with a couple of 100 feet of land in between them, which was called no man's land, that's what this was all about, was soldiers just trying to take a little bit of land and advance a little bit as they could. It was really sad. So the book talks about the great slaughter. But one thing I knew from my British history days, the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the first ones that Britain got into, they lost like 20,000 guys in the first day. So these are like Gettysburg Civil War type losses, just brutal automatic weapon losses out there in no man's land between the trenches. Eventually, the war widens, so the Middle Eastern countries come in, and the U.S. gets involved. Great Britain takes advantage of the situation and colonizes some of the Middle East and destroys what's left of the Ottoman Empire. You'll read about that in the book. And then the U.S. enters into the war, but not until 1917. And important that you know that here at the U.S., Americans really didn't want to get into this war at all. We had just, we're just sort of economy's booming. All right, it's the Roaring 20s, so things are pretty crazy here in the States. Unemployment's low, economy is looking real strong. And Wilson, the president at the time, really wants to avoid getting into the war, but has really no choice. And so a question on the quiz is, why does the U.S. get into the war? And there's two reasons on this slide. The sinking of the Lusitania is one reason, and the other reason is the Zimmermann telegram. And the Zimmermann telegram is cool because it's Zimmermann, who's like the Secretary of War in Germany, sends a coded telegram to Mexico basically saying, hey, Mexico, if you attack or let Germans into Mexico to attack the U.S., when we defeat the U.S. in war, we'll give you back all the western states that the U.S. took back in 1848, which is like California, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and a little bit of Utah, I think, actually. So that was a huge deal. So now Germany is coming into our backyard into Mexico saying, hey, Mexico, join us and we'll beat the U.S. and we'll give you your land back. So we intercepted that telegram, and that was one of the primary reasons with the sinking of the Lusitania that the U.S. got into the war. The other thing that happened in 1917 was we got into the war, Russia pulls out of the war, and the reason they do is because that's when the Russian Revolution happened. We talked about that a little bit in the beginning of the video. This is Lenin, all right? So you've heard of Lenin or Leninism. Lenin and the Bolsheviks take over and depose the Tsar. We talked about Tsar Nicholas early on. So again, it's sort of like in chapter 3 when we talked about the falling of the powerful families and the monarchs. That's what happens in 1917 in Russia. Lenin and the Marxists take over. It wasn't really Marxism, but I don't have time to talk about it right now. So there's Lenin, but it's a big deal, I think, in the context of today, because after the Russian Revolution, or ever since the Russian Revolution, Russia was communist. So, the USSR forms, around, after World War II, and we have Joe Stalin and a lot of history there. But Russia in the state that it is today, the communist Russia, that goes back to 1917 and the revolution. So keep that in mind. It's an important point. And so after the war ends, all right, there's a fragile peace. And I probably should have brought this out more in this presentation, but there's a little blurb right here that says the war ends with a fragile peace that punishes Germany with reparations, fines. Okay, so France and Great Britain want to make Germany pay big time for the war because Germany loses the war. There's the Treaty of Versailles, but it's not a sustainable treaty, and the reparations are brutal. So Germany is fined too much, is basically what happens, and there's no way they can pay it back. And they're pissed, all right? They're permanently angry about this, which sets the stage for World War II. But for right now, what we need to know is that upon the ending of the war, the Treaty of Versailles, Germany gets punished with big reparations, and they borrow money from the U.S. to pay the reparations. And when they can't pay anymore, that's one of the big causes of the Great Depression, that the European economy gets all screwed up, and the U.S., Germany starts defaulting on U.S. loans, and that causes problems in our economy, and the Great Depression happens. And so keep that in mind as we're reading through when we talked about the aftermath of the war and how important it is. Certainly the Russian Revolution and the Great Depression are the two things that happened after World War I that are really significant. So what lessons can we take from the Russian Revolution? Well, the first one is that when society is upset, and they're upset in the country and in the cities, rural and urban areas, that's a prime time for revolution. And that's what happens in the Russian Revolution. So if you look at page 90 in your text, it's going to talk about social discontent in cities and rural areas and how that leads to revolution. And that's a quiz question, so make sure you know that. And then the Great Depression is the other quiz question, is why does World War I, how is that related to the Great Depression? The actual question is, what are causes? A couple of causes of the Great Depression. And in this case, it's downturn in European economies, all right, and the stock market crash here in the U.S. But I think it's appropriate to talk about that right now because we talked about the end of World War I, these heavy fines or reparations that are levied against Germany, Germany's inability to pay, and Germany's inability to pay back the U.S. Causes economic problems here and causes the Great Depression. Everything is connected together. That's why it gets complicated. So there's that, and then really the takeaways from this as the war ends and as the chapter winds down is there are a lot of social changes that happen because of the war. And two of the biggies are women's rights and also civil rights, advances in civil rights for African Americans here in the U.S. So again, because when the war came, a lot of the men went off to war. Women stayed behind to work in the industrial factories. Happened again in World War II and in the next chapter or two. And so when women really had to start taking over all of the men's jobs when the men were at war, it really elevated the social status of women, or should have anyways, but really was important to the feminist movement. And evidence of that is the fact that the 19th Amendment passed in 1920 here in the U.S., and the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. So you can see, this is an area or a time of progressivism in the U.S. The war ends and women gain rights during this period of time, and African Americans, especially in the North, gain rights and conditions improve also. That's a quiz question. Make sure you know it. And then finally, another takeaway from the Great Depression. It's related to art a little bit, although I didn't have time to cover the art piece. But really, the rise of mass culture really starts after World War I, and I think it's important because our society is all about mass culture. What movies are popular in the country, the stuff that we all do together. And so mass culture is an important thing to understand, and it's important that there's changes in feature films, books, radio, and sports. Those things, films, books, radio, and sports, those four things really start to define mass culture in the U.S. That's a quiz question, and it's a tricky one, so make sure you get that. And that's it for this week. Tough chapter, but good to understand that World War I really leads to the Great Depression globally and in the U.S., and also the idea that the Treaty of Versailles is really an uneasy peace in the sense that World War II is going to emerge from this uneasy peace with the Treaty of Versailles. So that's what the chapter is all about. We covered the quiz questions. We covered the bulk of the chapter. Do the reading. You're going to do great. Have a great day. Take care. See you next week. Bye-bye.